I've spent, I guess, a little bit of time every day for a good solid month shooting with the Canon R5 as my main camera. And it's been a great experience. I know it's been out for quite a long time. Years. But I just got my hands on one because I was completely happy with my camera situation. I didn't really feel the need to upgrade, in quotation marks. Remove the quotation marks. It is a definite upgrade. It's a great camera. I've been shooting on the EOS R for the past 5 years or so. Always kind of wondered why it got so overshadowed so quickly. And now I kind of get it. It's because the R5 improves upon what the R is in basically every way. There was just one area where it's not meeting my needs, which is the image quality, ironically, because 45 megapixels, that's a lot of resolution, at least to me it is. Obviously there are cameras that offer more than 45 megapixels of resolution, and have been for a very long time. But to me that's a lot. I've never owned a camera with that much resolution. I've shot my share of 6x7 medium format film, and that has loads and loads of resolution, but as far as digital sensors go, 45 megapixels to me sounds like a million billion. So I'll just tell you right now, I end up returning the R5. It's not because I don't love it. It has a problem. I know that seems impossible that I got another camera with a problem, but I did. I even have physical evidence this time. It's not just my perception of how the images look. And so I share with you a piece of advice. If you see a problem with the image quality of your new camera or used camera, just look at the sensor. Just physically look at it. Here I was testing the IBIS high-res mode in the R5. I kind of figured it'd be a bullshit feature, and so far, yeah, the 45 megapixel shot actually looked better and sharper and had more detail. But I keep trying. Some of the 400 megapixel shots do look better, but not by as much as you would think. This is just a size comparison of 45 megapixels versus 400. Huge difference. It'd be cool to actually have a 400 megapixel sensor in your camera. But between these two shots, I don't know which I prefer the look of. The 45 megapixel kind of, you have no business zooming into it that far. And the 400, if it were truly a 400 megapixel shot, you would expect it to hold up a lot better. Like here, I guess I prefer the 400, and yet there's this kind of gross smoothing effect over everything. So, completely a mixed bag. I wish the feature were a little bit more of a serious attempt to give you something. It just sort of comes across like some desperate attempt to keep up with some other company. See how there's this soft focus look at the bottom? Places that are out of focus or may not be reflecting light back into the camera. But I thought, wow, that anti-aliasing filter on the R5 really is intense. Yeah. Actually, the sensor has, I found 4 bubbles in the filter over the sensor, just like the spherical imperfections. It's not dust. I mean, it kind of looks like dust, but it is, in fact, a bubble in the glass, and I found 4 of these. This one was the largest, and thus the easiest to photograph. That's why I returned the camera. It just seemed like, especially dealing with reflected light, but not always. I'm sure it had to do with the angle of the light, but it would just kind of get scattered around the frame, stray light, creating that soft focus look, or kind of like a cheap lens effect, except I'm using like a $2,400 lens. The colors on all these are shit, by the way, because I was shooting at noon and I didn't mind my white balance very carefully in camera, and these are JPEG straight out of camera. I actually prefer the 400 here quite a bit. That's interesting. So, just kind of a crapshoot. It is maybe not an entirely useless feature, but practically speaking, it's pretty useless. This one I failed to match the focus, so it didn't work well as a comparison, so I just picked the one I like better, which happened to be the 45 megapixel shot. When I was deciding upon my first ever pro camera, it was a decision between a 4 megapixel camera and a 6 megapixel camera. And I received some amazing advice that steered me toward the 4 megapixel camera, and I was so happy that I listened. And if those numbers don't make any sense to your modern ears, just multiply it by 10. A 40 megapixel camera versus a 60. Some people won't care and will just view them interchangeably, and some number of people will care and will be swayed by that. And it was just the same back then. The numbers were smaller, but the differences were the same. It's like thinking of music in terms of intervals and not notes. The note is irrelevant. It's the space between the notes that make you feel something. Anyway, from that moment on, I was so happy with my 4 megapixel camera that I stopped giving a flipping fuck about camera resolution. Prior to that, I thought it was very important. After that, I realized it wasn't. Because 4 megapixels of great subject with great light, with a great lens, looks amazing, and 45 megapixels of shit looks like 45 megapixels of shit. It's definitely all about what and how you're shooting, not what you're shooting with. So here I'm doing a resolution comparison between the R, the R5, and the 5D Mark II. And the 5D Mark II held up way better than I would have expected. This is zoomed way far in. But also there's a bigger difference between the R and the R5 than I expected. And keep in mind, this little sign here, that's where we were zoomed into. The 5D Mark II had no business holding up that well. Where the 5D Mark II has a great shutter release sound, the R has a terrible shutter release sound. But I really dig the R5, very understated. And that's just a size comparison of the 3 different resolutions. It's not that big of a deal, even going from the 5D Mark II to the R5. But when you look at it this way, yeah, it's a pretty big deal. Part of that is the lens, though. The 5D Mark II here is sporting an inferior lens. And I suspect with these rock shots, in particular, it's being held back when we zoom in for comparison. But overall, my feeling is, yeah, the R5 makes a difference over the R. Going from 30 to 45 megapixels, didn't expect it to be that noticeable, actually, but it's fairly noticeable. And then the other big surprise is just how well the 20 megapixel 5D Mark II sensor holds up. Oh, here's some more testing to see if I can recreate that soft focus look between the R and the R5. And sure enough, yes, the R5 has that soft focus look, and this is what led to me returning the camera. This is what led to me looking at the sensor and finding the problem, and then returning the camera. But it's also weird because the R5 looks higher res when I flip back and forth like that, so it looks both better and worse at the same time. But now I'm considering my next camera purchase, and I'm asking myself, how much should resolution weigh in on that decision? At first I spent a lot of time learning about researching Sony cameras, but then I started getting swayed over toward Fuji, and the Fuji GFX line, super expensive, but looks pretty amazing. I'm very interested in the 100S. The GFX 100S. Oh, look at the resolution difference here. I thought that was startling between the two cameras. Yeah, dig that R5. It's a great camera. It's a shame I don't own it anymore. But this Fuji camera I'm interested in, it is a 100 megapixel camera. And that's a big part of why I'm interested in it, if I'm being honest. So how is it resolution both doesn't matter to me and clearly does matter to me? How is it I could be happy with a 4 megapixel camera and simultaneously feel the need to upgrade from a 45 to a 100 megapixel camera? These are opinions which are directly contradictory to one another. Well, I thought about that a lot. I've also given a fair bit of camera advice over the years to new camera buyers, and the advice I used to give is completely irrelevant now. No longer makes sense or is true. Don't buy the latest entry-level camera. Buy the old pro cameras. That was always my advice. And by old, I mean like from 5-10 years ago. Technology will not help you take a better photo. Except, actually, it will now. New photographers, in my experience, always struggle nailing focus. Actually, in my experience, they struggle to nail focus, but don't realize they're struggling to nail focus. But that's been solved now. And that's the other side of it. Now that I've tasted this amazing modern autofocus from the R5, I really miss it. And I'm just not going to find anything like that on a 100 megapixel sensor anytime soon. It's just too much data coming off the sensor. Impossible to perform as many calculations per second. So that's the great dilemma now in choosing my next camera. Do I chase the resolution that I used to say doesn't matter, or do I chase the technology, autofocus, that I used to say doesn't matter? Look how soft that is, soft focus, I mean. I ended up not paying the restocking fee at Best Buy, but it was a really crazy scenario wherein it didn't matter that I showed evidence of a defect in the camera. They still said I could not get my money back. I mean, the full amount. I would have had to pay a $450 restocking fee, which I thought was insane. Like, you're seeing what I'm seeing, right? There's clearly a defect. I couldn't have caused a spherical pocket of air in the glass above the sensor. You don't, for example, like accidentally drop your camera and as a result spherical pockets of air form in the internal components. That is not a thing that happens in reality, at least. But I got my money back anyway because when they did the refund transaction, they just accidentally refunded all of it. So I have this weird combination of terrible luck and really good luck, and I guess contradiction is just the theme today. You know, I never crop my images. It's not like a religious thing. I just don't feel the need to do it, ever. But here I was shooting in an APS-C crop mode. I've never done that before on any camera. I just figured it was worth a try. Although I don't want to make comments like, hey, more resolution equals more room to crop, because, well, number one, that's extremely obvious. And number two, I don't know why you don't just shoot it the way you want it in camera. It's different if you're shooting sports or, you know, I don't know, people jumping around in the dark. You may not get it framed up exactly the way you want, but generally speaking, I don't know why you don't just compose a shot the way you want rather than cropping it in post, but whatever. There's probably a reason that I'm just not seeing. But cropping is not a thing that I do in particular, but just gave it a try for like 1 or 2 shots, APS-C crop mode, and looked pretty good. Image still held up real well. Yeah, because it's what I'm getting is like a 17 megapixel shot out of the camera in crop mode, and that's still a lot of resolution. But there is another thing weighing on my decision, my camera decision, my next purchase. I've always been swayed by what will be good for a client, more so than what would I have the most fun shooting on. And my excursion into film the last 4 or 5 years has been a lot about fulfilling my own needs. Clients be damned. And maybe it's time I start making my A-camera decisions, my main digital camera decision, based on what would be the most fun to shoot on, and not worry so much about what would be best for the clients. Those last couple of shots of flowers, leaves, and whatnot, and the next several, are edited in Dehancer. Everything before that was a JPEG straight out of camera. But that is another factor in resolution, right? You're editing in a program like Dehancer. I mean, it's right there in the name. You are actually degrading the image quality as part of the editing process. Not always, but in this case it's a film simulation, so it's adding grain, it is reducing sharpness, but it still looks great. I mean, you do that to get a look, you know. Shoot free lens, shoot through a Coke bottle, shoot instant film, shoot through a broken filter, use a tilt shift lens. I don't know, none of that is about maximizing sharpness and resolution, multi-exposure and shutter dragging. It's all about getting a look that's special, degrading the image in an artistic way. And because photography is not about the now, it's about preserving the moment into the future. I would say it's completely irrelevant when considering how much resolution you need to ask questions like, oh, what are you doing with the images now? And what kind of screen are you looking at them on now? Because presumably in the future you will want to do something different with them, and or look at them on a different screen. To say nothing of future generations, descendants, and so forth. So future-proofing makes a lot of sense to me, and always has. In fact, it weighed on my decision going all the way back to that 4 megapixel versus 6 megapixel camera decision. But here's another side to that. Now that I live in the future of that decision, and I look at the 4 megapixel images, I don't think, fuck, it's stuck at 4 megapixels. I think it looks of its time, and that's kind of cool too. And this is something I'm wary of because I shoot film as well. See, look how not sharp that is after editing it in Dehancer. And look how boring it is straight out of camera. Dehancer's providing everything that's interesting about that image. Ah, my good old friend, soft focus, glaring at me from the corner. So I may love shooting film and shooting on old expired film stocks, but I'm really careful how many important family moments I photograph that way, because I don't want to be sitting there in the 2050s having to explain why everything I shot in the 2020s looks like it was shot in the 1980s. I think the proper historical context is a cool thing. Things that look of their time, and I'm excluding like art projects. I'm talking about family photos, photos of my cat, photos of me and my wife. I want them to look up their time. I mean, I have scads of low megapixel shots of my mom. She's dead now. Think I don't value those images because the resolution is too low? Well, no, I don't think you think that. But what I'm saying is, would I rather have 100 megapixel shots of her from 20-something years ago? No. I'd rather have shots that look of their time. Anyway, that basically negates the need for future-proofing from that perspective, and I do think that's where I'm at. So I think although future-proofing used to be something that weighed on my mind, it doesn't anymore. That is, I do not believe that is a good reason to chase resolution over other concerns. There may indeed be a good reason, but I would have previously given that as my good reason, and I don't think it's a good reason. Here's with Dehancer, here's without Dehancer. I just wanted to show you without Dehancer because I wanted to zoom in and show you why I returned my camera yet again. Of course, at this point I didn't know I was going to return the camera, so all of these were really tests. A bee was trying to kill me here. I just barely got my shot off before I jumped up and ran away. And yet, in spite of everything I've said, I'm still drooling over that GFX 100S with its glorious 100 megapixel sensor. But the sensible thing to do, it seems to me, is to instead go after the best autofocus I can, because that will absolutely increase the quality of the images I'm getting now. Because I see a moment I want to capture, I whip the camera out, it's already in focus, probably, the way I want it. And I just capture it before anything has the chance to change and ruin the shot. Here we're just doing more A-B comparisons. The R5 continues to have that haze in certain lighting conditions. So I've never chased resolution before. Why would I start now? But that's not entirely true. I did make one previous camera purchase decision based on resolution. I was having a blast shooting 35mm film. This is going back like 4 or 5 years ago. And I decided to get a 6x7 medium format film camera because I wanted to have like gorgeous high-res negatives. But I almost never use that camera because 35mm is just very convenient. It's a lot of fun. Not once ever have I looked at one of my 35mm shots and thought, if only I'd shot this with more resolution. I like the look of that resolution, whatever it is, between 10 and 20 megapixels, approximately. This scene, I didn't care about, nor the last several. I just saw this reflective structure and the cables, and thought it would be a good test. Is the R5 hazier around the bright spots than the R? Yes, of course it is. Of course. So that was the last shot I took on my R5 before I returned it. I just needed to get out of that nightmare. And now I have time to consider my next camera purchase. It might be the Fuji. I might also wait and see what Canon does. It seems like something is about to be released. Of course, something is always about to be released with every company. And then whatever my decision is, ultimately, fast forward like a couple of weeks and I'll probably regret it.